Hello, and welcome to Very Cold Lasagna, your podcast for all your filthy casual takes on the world of sports. I am your host, Dylan Lasagna. This is episode number 272, and this episode, we are officially back. I know we came back in the last episode, number 271, with a WWE Vengeance retro review from 2005. After what felt like a month-long, no, it actually was a month-long break. A little bit of a layoff to mentally reset, recollect ourselves, and especially it's a good time to with the down period in sports. So we are officially back in this podcast capacity, and yeah, it's actually a good time to come back because it is a new month. Yes, it is, and we're halfway through 2025. It is a new month. It is the month of July, halfway through 2025, and normally with the topic at hand and the month-long topic at hand, you're probably wondering, why are you talking about this now when it's still 2 months away? Well, this is our usual time where we talk about this topic. And I'm talking about the NFL. The NFL season that is to come, the 2025 NFL regular season. So we are here to begin our month-long 2025 NFL regular season team previews. So we're going to be talking about all 32 teams in the National Football League leading up to the 2025 NFL regular season, even though it's still pretty much 2 months away. And in part one, which begins in this episode, we're going to be talking about the NFC West division. So we're going to break down exactly how this goes for all the newcomers, the new listeners to this podcast in just a bit, because I want to catch up with all of you. I want to catch up to all my listeners, whether you're new or all my vets out there, because, man, it has been quite some time. It has been quite some time since I've done a podcast episode, other than the last episode, which was the retro review of Vengeance for WWE. And it's felt weird. It's felt like there's been not been much going on when it comes to the NFL, the NBA. I mean, obviously, playoffs are done with now, and now we're still prepping up for the NFL season, and now sports are still now in a holding pattern with the off season. And when it comes to wrestling, there really isn't much going on other than a lot of injuries as of late, especially on the WWE side. So you're missing a lot of key players, especially to key players. You have injuries and all these, I wouldn't say controversies, but a lot of weird stuff happening in the world of wrestling, and not a lot of good, interesting stuff. Where, especially in the post-WrestleMania period, where it's always a downtime, but you still have to keep stuff interesting for all those wrestling fans that don't exactly want to watch other stuff. But not to steer too much off topic, but that's just my little side tangent to start off the show before we get into the main topic. So with that being said, let's get into the main topic at hand. And that is the beginning of our 2025 NFL season team previews, with part one being with the NFC West. So what can you expect with our season team previews? I've been doing these filthy casual season previews for about 3 years now on the podcast. We started these in 2022, so about a year after I started Very Cold Lasagna. So we've been doing these for three regular seasons now. So we've done the season recaps, we've done the team previews. So now here we are again doing the season previews for all 32 teams in the NFL. So how we do it is we do it in the order in which each team is discussed, from the worst to first by division. So we're going to be covering 4 teams in this episode. And the main points that we're going to be covering is like a little bit brief summary of the team's prior season, the key moves and events that happened during the offseason that made the team better or worse on paper, because you never know what's going to happen in the actual season that is to come. What I took away from each their offseason, and looking at some of the key games that are to come in the regular season and my biggest questions or concerns to consider for each team in the upcoming season. Now, each preview is subject to change, especially with the much later ones, like with the AFC East, the NFC East, like the South, et cetera, because training camp is going to happen. Probably for the later ones though, but for I'd say half of these team preview episodes, not much is going to change. Not much is going to be subject to change, but you never know. You never know. Something might happen. And keep in mind, these team previews don't take into account for the most part of what has happened in the team activities in May or the mini camps in June for the most part, because I mean, during this time as a casual sports fan, I don't take too much into account. So that's a little bit of disclaimer for all you hardcore football fans out there that really analyze and dissect into this stuff. So if you somehow come across this podcast, a little bit disclaimer for you, and feel free to roast me in the comments. I mean, I'll take it into consideration, but I'll just go, okay, I'm cool with that. So just a little bit of disclaimer for you. So let's begin our 2025 NFC West season preview with what better way to start it off, honestly, than somehow, some way, my team. My team ended up on this list, and that team being the San Francisco 49ers. So interesting how my team ended up being the first one on this list to kick off not just the NFC West preview list, but also the entirety of the NFL season previews as a whole. We began our season recaps with my San Francisco 49ers, and now here we are, beginning the season previews once again. So 2024 didn't exactly pan out for my team because they were off the heels of a Super Bowl 54, and just like 2 years prior with Super Bowl 50? Oh no, just a couple of years ago, Super Bowl 54, and here they were a couple years later, Super Bowl 58, losing again in heartbreaking fashion. They once again were the victim of the loser's curse. Injuries, underperformances from pretty much the entire team, and the quarterback, Brock Purdy, was no different. He was included from that list. So they pretty much finished the season 6-11, and yeah, here they were. From pretty much like being 6-11, and they faced a lot of questions, and they also were facing questions of a lot of roster turnover, and what they were going to do in this upcoming offseason. So obviously the goal for my 49ers this coming season in 2025 was to not only make the playoffs, but to develop these young core of players that they were going to bring in, whether it's through free agency or especially through the draft. So looking at the key needs that I addressed all the way back in January was the main one being addressing the trenches, especially the offensive line, because that was one of the, I'd say one of the worst in the NFL. It was so bad in 2023. No, not even 2023. Way back in 2022, where it injured Trey Lance, it injured Jimmy Garoppolo, and it also cost the 49ers the NFC Championship game in Philadelphia. And then, in 2023, it also cost the 49ers the Super Bowl. I will never forgive, I think it was Spencer Burford, for blowing his assignment against Chris Jones. And Brock Purdy could have had the game-winning touchdown to Brandon Ayuk, but no. That all went to shit. So anyway, they had to address the trenches because especially on the center, the right guard, and the right tackle positions were shit. And then the defensive side of the ball, Nick Bosa didn't really have much help. Leonard Floyd was kind of underwhelming. And the interior defensive line in the interior, defensive tackle position, there wasn't really much run defensive support. They also had to make a decision on their aging players like Deebo Samuel, Javon Hargrave. They really had to make a decision because they're making so much money, but they were not performing up to their standards anymore. They also had to make a decision on extending Brock Purdy because Brock Purdy was coming up on that third year. Yeah, third year. And they had to decide on if they were going to extend him, how much money we're going to give. That was the big talking point all offseason on, well, how much we were going to give the kid. How much we were going to give this man. Because had they not given him that money, his agent was going to force him to hold out, or the Niners were just going to have him play on that fifth year, player option. And then, yeah, we'll go from there. So looking at some of the offseason moves that the 49ers have made, obviously they lost some of their key players, like Charvarius Ward was probably the biggest one, but I understood it because he had a lot of crazy things happen to him in the 2024 season. So he understandably said he needed to change the scenery. Probably one of the bigger losses, though, was linebacker Dre Greenlaw, but however, he only played 2 games last season because he was recovering from the Achilles injury suffered in the Super Bowl. But everyone else was pretty much expendable, like Aaron Banks at guard, Talanoa Hufanga at safety. But incoming was safeties Richie Grant and Jason Pinnock, receiver DeMarcus Robinson, and interestingly enough, the quarterback that Kyle Shanahan desperately wanted in the 2021 NFL draft, Mac Jones. Mac and Cheese Jones from the Jaguars. So he's probably going to be taking the backup role, the Sam Darnold esque role from 2023 as well. So the draft is where the 49ers did most of their work. Getting edge rusher Mykel Williams. He's a raw but interesting prospect. And they also got defensive tackle Alfred Williams from Texas, linebacker Nick Martin from Oklahoma State, and then corner Upton Stout from Western Kentucky. It was mostly a defensive line and mainly defensive draft. And honestly, mainly why this is because, well, they replaced defensive coordinator Nick Sorensen, rightfully so, with the return of Robert Saleh. So that's why this was such a defensive draft, because that defense needed a very serious upgrade. So hopefully, with all these moves at defense and the return of Robert Saleh, you'll see a significant return in investment. And also in replacement with coordinators, it also brings in special teams coordinator Brian Boyer. So both of them spent time with the Jets. So they have some synergy. They have some chemistry with each other. So hopefully they bring their relative experience from the Jets and over to San Francisco. So they released defensive tackles Javon Hargrave and Malik Collins, but like I said, they replaced them in the draft anyway. They had to get younger. They traded receiver Deebo Samuel to Washington. So again, making a decision on trading away these aging and underperforming players like Deebo and Javon Hargrave. They also traded away, a little bit surprisingly, Jordan Mason to the Vikings, but probably had to do with Christian McCaffrey and Isaac Guerendo, and Mason probably wanted to be a starter. So probably the biggest takeaway though was the extensions. The extensions to the big three players on my 49ers. Giving George Kittle a 3-year deal and giving linebacker Fred Warner a 3-year deal. And each of them are deserved. They perform relatively well. But the most interesting aspect of the big three was giving Brock Purdy a big fat 5-year deal. And I believe is around $265 million when this was announced back in mid-May when they got this done. So for the most part, I'm glad all these extensions got done well before the season started, well before June. So I'm glad that Jed York and John Lynch and Parag Marathe all got this contract-free drama done before June. I'm glad it got done. And so for the first time in forever, there's no drama. There's no contract-free drama. No extension talk going into training camp. But when it comes to Brock Purdy's extension, initially I thought to myself, I mean, probably a lot of people too at the time, it was a big overpay. 5 years, $265 million. But when I looked at the a little bit of the numbers, I mean, again, I'm not too much of a numbers guy as a casual sports fan. The bigger cap hits don't really come until much later. So even though they do have the option to let him go, I'd say at least a year or two if he somehow underperforms. If the dead cap money in the first 3 years is large. So the 49ers, I'd say it's a relatively solid deal. It's a little bit of a solid extension, and they can have a little bit of a hard out, if you know what I mean. But I could be wrong. So the big takeaway from this 49ers offseason is that it's relatively drama-free. But again, it's not all drama-free. I said relatively. It's not all drama-free because there were a few things. That prevented it from being such, like Brandon Ayuk's cryptic Instagram stories. And at least it doesn't mean that Ayuk wants to be traded as he works his way back from the ACL tear. And then most recently, you had corner Diamador Lenore getting arrested for I don't know. It seems like it's a really weird thing, like a misdemeanor. And the reasons for why the cops in LA arrested him are unknown at the moment. But let's just hope that it stays that way. It just stays as a misdemeanor, nothing serious. And if it is something serious, I don't know. I don't know why even and his little buddy did that in the first place. But when it comes to on the field stuff for the 49ers, the Niners defense obviously should be better as long as the rookies and second year players can develop. And that's probably going to be the biggest thing. That defense, outside of Fred Warner and Nick Bosa, they're going to be relatively young. But the offensive line, I got to say, I don't know why Hal Shanahan and John Lynch continue to neglect this. Like, there's still a lot of problems with this offensive line. They're really banking on a line that has a current crop of Trent Williams and Dominic Pooney. Like, it's still open season when it comes to Colton McKivitz. You still have a big nag at right guard. And Jake Brendel at center. It's bad. It's still really bad. The interior outside of Dominic Pooney is terrible. It is terrible. The fact that Ed, Kyle, and John didn't even make an attempt to address those other three spots in free agency or the draft it's bad. It's bad. It's like, if you want your newly paid big fat quarterback to be protected well, you want that new investment to be paid well, then you got to protect them. You got to protect them at least. I don't know why they didn't. So looking at some of the key games for the 49ers this coming season, obviously you point to week 1 in Seattle, and it's also going to be a familiar game for the Seahawks as well because they establish their own new quarterback in Sam Darnold. Then you have the home opener after 2 straight road games, and it's another one against a division rival in Arizona as they face Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison Jr. Then you point to both division games against the LA Rams, last season's division winner, weeks 5 and 10. So that's going to be very important as well. And then you have an interesting stretch. Week 12 and 13, Carolina on Monday Night Football, and then 6 days later, going to Cleveland to take on the Browns. So the Niners have to be careful, especially if they're in the playoff stretch. So they have to be careful if they're not in a trap. They don't fall into these trap games. So My biggest questions for the 49ers going into this season is that until Brandon Ayuk returns from his ACL MCL tear, who's going to be the primary receiver outside of Juwan Jennings? Because obviously there has to be other options like Ricky Pearsall, Jacob Counting, but who's going to be that number 2 besides Juwan Jennings? Because there's got to be somebody. And this offensive line proved me wrong. Besides Trent Williams and Dominic Pooney. Now, again, there's still a lot to be decided in training camp, but it's not exactly promising right now. So for the 49ers, there's a lot of potential coming off another injury-riddled, Super Bowl hangover-filled season last year. And they had a lot of moves that needed to make, whether by choice or not. Now, this coming season, they may have the easiest season on paper. It's the schedule. It's the easiest on paper schedule, but that often doesn't really matter for a lot of teams. Like teams in the past have had the easiest schedule in the league, but that doesn't always translate to success. Given that the 49ers addressed one of their primary needs and not all of them, that easy schedule not only guarantees not a return to the playoffs, but it also may not matter, for pretty much everyone in the red and gold. And if the Niners don't take advantage of that easy schedule, then maybe Kyle Shanahan's seat may be even hotter than it normally is. So let's move on to the Arizona Cardinals. And with the Cardinals last season, they jumped out to a 6-4 start to the season in 2024, and it put them in a 3-way division race alongside Seattle and the LA Rams. But just like in seasons past, they fell apart again. They fell apart late in the season. They had trouble staying consistent on offense, and they had a poor secondary, and that all led to another late season collapse. No matter if Kingsbury was there or Jonathan Gannon was there, they somehow always fall victim to a late season collapse. They suffered tough, close losses. It was all enough to, again, miss out on the playoffs at 8-9. But despite missing out on the playoffs, there still was at least some reason for optimism on offense. But that head coach duo of Jonathan Gannon and Monty Ossenfort, they really need to take an aggressive approach to improve their squad. So when you look at this Arizona team, obviously the goal for this upcoming season is to avoid another late season collapse. That's number one. Number two is make the playoffs. That's the second goal. You necessarily can't focus on winning the division because obviously you want to make the playoffs first. You want to clinch a playoff spot first. So looking at some of their key offseason needs for Arizona was mainly centered around the defense because that was a primary weakness for this team. So they wanted to upgrade the defensive line in all positions because they basically had no pass rush at all this last season. They also wanted to add some help around corner Garrett Williams because outside of him, that pass defense was pretty much attackable. You saw it all season long, and that led to their demise late last year, especially in games where Kyler Murray was under-delivering. And they had to retool the interior offensive line because it was okay. It was solid. There were still some weaknesses where it really leaked out. In midway through the season. But the good thing about Arizona during their offseason was that they had a lot of people that were expendable. So they didn't really lose anyone of note. But they did add a couple people that were notable, like edge rusher Josh Sweat from the Philadelphia Eagles. They also added defensive tackle Dalvin Tomlinson from the Browns, right tackle Kelvin Beachum, and corner Sean Murphy Bunting from, I believe it was the Lions or the Bucks the last time out. But either way, they revamped up their defense. So their defense should be much better. And then they continued their defensive approach in the draft. Some of their notable picks included defensive tackle Walter Nolan from Ole Miss, corner Will Johnson from Michigan, edge rusher Jordan Burt from Oregon, and linebackers Cody Simmons and corner Denzel Burke from Ohio State. So this defense for Arizona should be much more improved from last season, at least on paper. Especially looking at the defensive line, it has much better depth around them. Around second-year player Darius Robinson, as long as he continues to develop, because I thought last season was kind of a disappointment for him. And veteran Zayvon Collins, especially with those talented veterans, Josh Sweat coming off a Super Bowl winning season for him, and Dalvin Tomlinson. As well as you got promising rookie Walter Nolan. That depth is going to be much better for Jonathan Gannon. And in the secondary, when you look at that group of Budda Baker, Garrett Williams, and Max Milton, and then they made it a priority, adding the likes of Sean Murphy Bunting, and you got rookies in there with Will Johnson and Denzel Burke, and it's a really good fit for all of them. Like that depth and around the defense, that makes it a really good get for Gannon, for Jonathan Gannon. So right now, on paper at least, the Cardinals should have a much better defense as long as they perform well. So Arizona focused on their other needs, like extending their key players, like extending tight end Trey McBride to a new 4-year deal, like deservedly so, because he was like the main focus for Arizona's offense for like the last 2 seasons. Extending guard Evan Brown to a new 2-year deal, that is okay. And then extending edge rusher Baron Browning to a new 2-year deal. So they locked down their key players. So while I thought that they ensured their key fixtures for their respective roles, I was also kind of hoping that they would add some upfront help for Kyler Murray, because especially in the interior, yeah, it's still kind of lacking in to a degree. So looking at some of the key games for the Arizona Cardinals, week 3, they had to head up to San Francisco for an very early key divisional game. Then they head back home to face the Seahawks in another key pivotal early season pivotal game, and then they go home week 7 to take on the Green Bay Packers in a key NFC game if they're in playoff contention by that point midseason. And then a very interesting game, week 15 in Houston. Kyler Murray taking on CJ Stroud. It's an interconference game between NFC and AFC teams, but it's always fun to see both mobile quarterbacks. But it's still a key game for Arizona to win, even though not necessarily tied to their NFC standing. So for the Arizona Cardinals going into this upcoming season, you have to ask the question about Marvin Harrison. Harrison Jr. Didn't make an immediate impact in his rookie year, and my hope for Marvin Harrison Jr. was about his connection with Kyler Murray. Obviously they brought him in with that, I think it was the 3rd or 4th overall pick last year. And we were all hoping that he was going to make an immediate impact and that chemistry was going to be right there. And that certainly didn't turn out to be the case. Now that they had a full offseason to work with now, Jonathan Gannon will have to hope that Harrison Jr. can emerge as that deep threat that he was supposed to be for Murray last season. So can he have a breakout year too? Now, also, how will this retooled defense actually perform? So like I said, they got all these bunch of key pieces and added to much needed depth, whether it's in free agency or in the draft. And so they did a very good job. But like I said so many times, how that turns out in execution on the field remains to be seen. And as long as they stay healthy, they could be a really good depth, and they can improve significantly this coming season. And we could get a good glimpse of that in preseason relatively soon, in about a month. So Arizona, again, were the victims of another self-meltdown, but they did a good job addressing their problematic areas, especially in the defense, that caused that collapse. Now, it'll be all about execution on not just Jonathan Gannon's coaching, but pretty much everyone else. especially that defense and especially Kyler Murray to prevent another late season collapse in 2025 in order to compete for not just a playoff spot, but for the NFC West as well. Now we move on to the Seattle Seahawks, and this Seahawks team had an interesting offseason in the Emerald City. But before we get to that, the Seahawks, they brought in a new head coach in Mike McDonald. So they moved Pete Carroll to an advisory position before he moved on to something else, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the Seahawks in 2024, they hired Mike McDonald from the Baltimore Ravens, but it was still more of the same for them as they barely lost out on the NFC West and the playoff field altogether to the LA Rams via one of the weirdest tiebreakers. It was like it's strength of victory tiebreaker that no filthy casual will understand, like myself. So they still finished with a winning record, 10-7, but they still didn't make the playoffs. Yeah, call me curious. So they were hoping to make year 2 better, but they had to make some difficult decisions this past offseason because, well, they didn't have much money, and they had a lot of choices to make. They had some choices to make when it came to the entire team. So obviously for the Seahawks, their goal was to make the playoffs, whether as a wild card team or outright winning the NFC West. But again, it was difficult. It was going to be difficult on what they had to do because some of their needs had to be finding a trade partner for their top receiver, DK Metcalf, because he was getting pretty frustrated when it comes to getting money, getting extended, all that stuff. So he requested a trade a month before free agency. And as such, they had to find 2 new top receivers to go alongside Jackson Smith and Jigba. Still hard to pronounce it after, 2 years after I got roasted in the comments on YouTube for mispronouncing his name. But anyway, so they had to find 2 new top receivers to go alongside JSN because, they not only had to trade DK Metcalf, but I'll mention it in a bit. They also released another receiver. So they also had to retool the interior offensive line because that's been one of Seattle's major weaknesses the last 2 seasons. So speaking of which, on that receiver that I talked about, they traded DK Metcalf to the Steelers for this year's 2nd round pick. So they got rid of one elephant in the room, but also they released Tyler Lockett. So that pretty much goes back to my point of an offseason need of, finding 2 new top receivers to go alongside Jackson Smith and Jigba. There you go, for all the people that roast me in the comments for mispronouncing his name. So another interesting decision, though, came to the quarterback, Geno Smith, because he was owed a lot of money. Because of that extension that he signed. I think it was after the 2022 season. So they traded away Geno Smith to the Raiders for this year's 3rd round pick. And they re-signed a few key people like edge rusher Ernest Jones the 4th and defensive tackle Jaron Reed, which was one of my team needs for the Seahawks. So probably the biggest takeaway, though, was trading away Geno Smith to the Raiders for this year's 3rd round pick, which was kind of a surprising but not so surprising move given that, Pete Carroll, the former Seahawks head coach and former advisor, he was the new head coach for the Raiders. So this was probably a Pete Carroll move to go and get Geno Smith on that team. So when it comes to the Seahawks, though, now they had to find a quarterback. Now they had to make a decision on who's going to be the new quarterback for the Seahawks. So looking at some of the people that they lost, not really too much of note, like Trey Brown, Draymond Jones, Lincoln Tomlinson, and like I said, Tyler Lockett, they let him go. But when it comes to the additions, though, obviously those are much bigger. And the biggest addition of all was quarterback Sam Darnold from the Minnesota Vikings. And we'll talk about Sam Darnold in a bit because there were some other notable additions like offensive lineman Josh Jones from the Ravens, edge rusher DeMarcus Lawrence from the Cowboys. They managed to steal him away. And then a bunch of receivers like Steve Sims, Marcus Valdez-Scantling, and probably a little bit surprising the bunch, Cooper Kupp from the division rival Rams. Yeah, the Rams released him, and then the Seahawks snatched him up. Interesting how things worked out for them. And then when you look at the draft, the Seahawks had an interesting one at that. They addressed the offensive line by getting guard Grace Zabel from North Dakota State, but their draft was kind of all over the place. Safety Nick Emmanwori from South Carolina. They kind of got a tight end in Elijah Arroyo from Miami. And then a quarterback that could possibly develop in the future, Jalen Milroe from Alabama. And then, yeah, it's pretty much all over the place for the Seahawks. But when you look at this Seahawks offseason and heading into 2025, they gave Sam Darnold a lot of money. They gave Sam Darnold like 3 years, $100 million. And they have to be banking on Sam Darnold really performing, because he's going to make or break the Seahawks 2025. Now, granted, Sam Darnold had his best season in Minnesota last year, but that was up until the last game, winner-take-all game in Detroit, where the NFC North and the NFC's top seed was on the line, but he shit the bed. He shit the bed in that game, and he also shit the bed in the playoff game against the LA Rams, which was in Arizona at the time, where he looked like the old, struggling Sam Darnold that was seeing ghosts. Now, granted, also in fairness, his offensive line was shit. His offensive line let him down. But Sam Darnold, excuse me, he also didn't do enough as well to get his team to rally in that game. He also have to learn from another offensive coordinator in Clint Kubiak, who replaces Ryan Grubb in that role, and how he'll fare in a new system will define Seattle's season. So the Seattle Seahawks, when it comes to their offseason, their offensive line remains to be seen, but at least they addressed it somewhat, especially the interior with right guard Gray Zabel to address in the interior while drafting 2 tackles. But how they'll do in game action is wait and see. We'll see how they do in preseason. And look at the receiver room, man. It's really crowded, and maybe it's a good thing. They traded away DK Metcalf. They released Tyler Lockett, but they added a bunch of depth. Not only did they add Cooper Kupp, but they also signed Steven Sims, Marcus Valdez-Scantling, and they drafted a guy, Trey Horn, in day 3 of the draft. They also drafted a decent tight end in Elijah Arroyo. So at least they have much more options for Sam Darnold to go to. Although not all of them could make the cut on the roster, but at least Sam Darnold has some options to go to outside of Jackson Smith-Njigba, who now becomes the de facto top receiver on this team. So looking at the key games for the Seahawks in the Emerald City this season, the number one game so far for the Seahawks is obviously pointing towards week 1 against the San Francisco 49ers. Both of these teams kind of, at least on the Seattle side, they're looking different. 49ers are kind of retooled in some way. So this is going to be a big test for both of these teams right out of the gate. Then you look at week 4, going to the desert, taking on Arizona in another key divisional game. And then you look at week 9, going to the nation's capital to take on the Commanders and Jaden Daniels. That's going to be another major test against a rising quarterback in his second year. And then you go to week 11, going to LA to take on the LA Rams and facing Cooper Kupp's old team. That's going to be another big must-win game for the Seahawks. So I pointed to this earlier for the Seahawks. The biggest question of all for the Seahawks team is about Sam Darnold. Going back to that Sam Darnold takeaway, he did almost well in Minnesota until those last 2 games. So the Seahawks are going to have to hope that they get the good Sam Darnold to show up if they want to compete, not just for this division, but just for a playoff spot in general. They need him to live up to that 3-year, $100 million contract that they gave out to him. And yeah, they better hope it pays off. Like, they really have to. So overall, when you look at this upcoming season for the Seattle Seahawks, they made some bold but needed changes by trading away DK Metcalf, trading away Geno Smith. But they made some kind of risky moves by getting Cooper Kupp, who was showing his sign of age in his last season with the Rams, and giving a big, risky contract to Sam Darnold, who only had his best season last year in Minnesota. So year 2 under Mike McDonald will greatly depend on which Sam Darnold he gets. The good one for most of last year with the Minnesota Vikings, or the familiar one that many of us have remembered him for. The one that was just mid and was often seeing ghosts, whether it was in Carolina or with the New York Jets. Wrapping things up with a bow with our 2025 NFL season team previews, part 1 is the LA Rams. So the Rams overcame an injury-riddled slow start in 2024 and a brief offensive slump late in the season to edge the Seahawks and win the NFC West in that weird tiebreaker scenario for the first time since 2021. And they had an interesting playoff run. Despite being an underdog in that game against the Vikings, the Rams whooped their butts in the first round before they fell just short of upsetting the Philadelphia Eagles, the eventual Super Bowl champions, in snowy Philadelphia in the divisional round. So they came just that short of beating Philadelphia in the snow. So despite falling short, the Rams produced a strong finish, giving Sean McVay and Les Snead a strong foundation for the upcoming season to try and retain their grasp on the NFC West for this upcoming season. So speaking of which, the goal for this upcoming season for the Rams is to not only make the playoffs again, but go on a deeper playoff run. So looking at some of the needs for the Rams this past offseason, as I mentioned in my team recap, and all the team recaps you could check out on the podcast, they need some help at middle linebacker because that was kind of a weakness in both the middle passing game and the run defense. He also had to address the cornerback spot in the draft because they didn't have much help there. And they need some help at receiver because age was showing for Cooper Kupp. And because age was showing for Cooper Kupp, that meant Puka Nacua, their emerging top rookie receiver, wasn't getting much help. So looking at some of the events that happened for the Rams this past offseason, they traded away their guard in Jonah Jackson to the Chicago Bears for this year's 6th-round pick. So yeah, they stole away. The Bears stole away the Rams, one of the Rams starting guards. And then one of the talking points this past offseason for the Rams was whether or not Matthew Stafford was going to get traded away or stay with the Rams. And he ended up staying on a restructured 2-year deal. So that's good for the Rams, but how Matthew Stafford's going to perform, given that he's getting older, remains to be seen. They also re-signed a couple of other people like Jimmy Garoppolo, Ahkello Witherspoon, and Troy Reader to new 1-year deals. But honestly, one of the other bigger talking points was releasing receiver Cooper Kupp, who ended up signing with the Seahawks soon after. They also re-signed left tackle Alaric Jackson to a 3-year deal, Matthew Stafford's most reliable hand on the offensive line. And he also signed receiver Devontae Adams, who was released by the Jets, to a 2-year deal, replacing Cooper Kupp. So interesting stuff by the Rams to assure that they will retain their grasp on the NFC West. So looking at some of the other moves that they made this past offseason, some of the people that they lost, not really all that notable, like other than defensive tackle Bobby Brown, who in my opinion got a little bit overpaid by I believe it was the Panthers. And some of the additions that they did get, like I said, Devontae Adams, defensive tackle Puna Ford from pretty much the other side of LA, aka the Chargers, and offensive lineman Coleman Shelton from the Bears. But a lot of the moves were made through the draft, like tight end Terrence Ferguson from Oregon, edge rusher Josiah Stewart from Michigan, and running back Jarquez Hunter from Auburn. Those are just some of the key moves that the Rams made. So when you look at the Rams offseason, they had very few draft picks again, but they had a better haul. They're going to have a better haul in the long term because they fleeced. They made a deal to fleece the Falcons out of a first-round pick next year. So this won't have season-long ramifications, like I said, in the short term. But in the long term, I found it crazy that the Falcons actually gave away next year's first to trade up for the players that they wanted for the Rams' 26th first-round pick. That's nuts. That's absolutely insane. So Les Snead, the general manager, he's like kind of a smart guy. So instead of Les Snead, trading away all of his draft picks, like in years past, he's doing the reverse Uno card of that this time around. So he came out of this draft. Sure, he had very few picks, like I said. Now, next year, he has 2 first-round picks in that draft. So, moving on, like I said, Davante Adams is coming in, replacing Cooper Kupp, and now it's going to come to the question of whether or not he's going to be a big help for Puka Nacua, who's going to be entering his second year. So now in comes Davante Adams. He picked it up late in production last year as a Jet, although that was when the Jets were pretty much eliminated from playoff contention. So yeah, Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams, you're just like trying to be tryhards for their next teams when the season was already done with for New York on Gang Green. But regardless, Nacua is hoping that Davante Adams can replicate on that late season production that he had with Gang Green and hopefully try to replicate some of that success prior to joining Las Vegas when Davante Adams was in his prime with Green Bay. Especially, given that Nacua, like I said, didn't have much help in like last season when Nacua was really showing his age. Not Nacua, Cooper Kupp was showing his age. So looking at the key games for the defending NFC West champion LA Rams, you look towards week 3, going back to Philadelphia for NFC divisional playoff rematch against the Philadelphia Eagles. That's going to be an early key game to determine seeding and determining playoff spots for each of these teams. And then you look to weeks 5 and 10 against the San Francisco 49ers, with the Rams hosting the first game and then having to go to Santa Clara for the second one. And I feel like it's going to be a key divisional battles for both of these teams, which again are probably going to be the top two teams competing for that division crown. And then you look towards week 15 with the Detroit Lions. Matthew Stafford facing his old team at home. I mean, it's always a fun matchup when you think about it, with Stafford facing his old team. Only this time, after facing his old team in Detroit, now the tables have turned. They have to go to him. So the biggest question for these Rams going into this season, it's not necessarily centered around Matthew Stafford because, well, it's always going to be centered around his age. But it's about which running back will emerge as the top back, because they haven't had a starting running back in quite some time now. Because the moment Sean McVay and Les Snead use a 4th-round pick on a running back, competition was likely going to be on hand because Kyren Williams had his best season last year. But, I mean, honestly, nothing is guaranteed if someone like Jarquez Hunter or Ronnie Rivers is going to challenge him. So, I mean, yeah, like I said, Kyren Williams is a solid hand in the last season or two, but nothing is guaranteed. And then the defense. The defense was probably one of the best ones in the NFL last year, and probably the big beat of last year with that young core with Kobe Durant, Darius Williams, Byron Young. So can that young defense replicate last year's success? And they made some solid additions with Poona Ford in the interior, rookie Josiah Stewart. So, yeah, they have some interesting pieces there. And going back to those two guys, I made a little bit of a questionable error there because those two are corners, and that corner spot does remain a question mark. So a little bit of error, a little bit of accountable error on my end. So looking at the Rams overall going into this season, it was a little bit quiet for the most part, but they did a little bit of their dirty work in the draft. But they still managed to make some solid moves, like replacing Cooper Kupp with Devontae Adams and fleecing the Atlanta Falcons of their first round pick next year. So they still have some concerns in a few areas. But I do think the Rams are still in a good position to repeat as NFC West champions. And, well, go as far as Matthew Stafford takes them if they make the playoffs. And that is going to put a wrap on part 1 of our 2025 NFL season team previews. And part 1 ended with the NFC West. Part 2, we're going to shake things up a bit. And you'll find out in the next episode. So we wrapped up part 1 with the NFC West, those teams being my San Francisco 49ers, the Arizona Cardinals, the Seattle Seahawks, and the Los Angeles Rams. How do you think these teams will fare in the upcoming season? Let me know in the comments below. Let's have a conversation about it, whether it's on YouTube or on my socials. Follow my socials, whether it's on Twitter or Instagram at @VeryColdLasagna. Let's have a conversation about it. And yeah, we're just getting started here in the month of July with our season team preview month. But anyway, that's going to do it for this episode of Very Cold Lasagna. I am your host, Dylan Lasagna, bringing you all the filthy casual takes on the world of sports. Until the next episode, keep that lasagna very cold in the fridge with your takes. And until see ya when I see you in the next one. Peace.